Hi, good evening everybody, and welcome to the daily Rambam Shiur, 3 chapters per day. I heard once a story from my mashpia, Reb Melech Olav Shalom Tzvibel. He said that once upon a time, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe turned to one of his greatest Hasidim. His name was Reb Chatzke Feigin. He was the personal secretary of the Frierdiker Rebbe. He was a great mashpia and a dedicated chassid. And he told him, I have rachmonus, I have pity on you. And he explained him why. He says, since the literature of Hasidism speaks so much about esoteric concepts, so in order to make those concepts understandable, so different allegories are being introduced in order to make it to be able to understand those concepts. So he says like this: the Rebbes, the masters, they understand the concept itself. The simple Hasidim, they are able to understand the allegory. They don't understand the concept, but they understand the allegory because this is an example that is from their life. And you are somewhere in between. You are not simple any longer, so therefore you don't really get those allegory because you're so removed from that world, yet you didn't reach yet a level of a Rebbe. And for that reason, you don't understand not the nimshol, not the concept itself, and not the moshol, and not the example, the allegory that is being introduced. I was thinking about this story because today in Halacha, and in fact this is the central subject that the Rambam deals with it today in the first 2 chapters, is the subject of Chol Hamoed. Chol Hamoed is the period that is between the first and the last day of Passover and between the first and last day of Sukkot. And this is a period that even the Talmud is referring to the rules, regulation, restriction, limitation as halachot akarot. It's very hard to find a common thread and consistent logic that will be able to assist us to get to the roots of it. In fact, there is a cloud of unclarity that is really covering those halachot, and throughout the shiur today we'll try to find somewhat of a common thread that goes through this halachot as well. One of the greatest Hasidim who ever lived, known as Reb Hillel Paritcher, and it is told that the second Rebbe had 2.5 Hasidim. 2 of them are quite famous, and what is the half? It says half was Reb Hillel Paritcher because he was half a Rebbe himself. And he was called by his peers and by the community, he was nicknamed as Chol Hamoed. He was a youngster that in the age of 12, he already possessed solid knowledge of the entire Talmud, the Kabbalah, and the rest of the Jewish literature. And he was already married before he reached a maturity of 13 years old. And the reason why he was called Chol Hamoed, because our custom that in Chol Hamoed you are not wearing tefillin, but you are covered with the talit. So as well, since he have not reached the age of bar mitzvah yet, he was not wearing tefillin yet. On the other hand, since he was already married, so he was covered with a talit as well. So he was called Chol Hamoed as a personality, a walking Chol Hamoed, in the sense that he was covered with a talis, before he had a chance to put on tefillin. By the way, for that reason, according to one of the interpretation, when a child is born, right at the bris, we are wishing Keshem that you brought the child into the bris, into the covenant, you should have the merit to raise him, Torah, Chuppah, and Ma'asim Tovim. And the question is, Torah, obviously he starts to learn Torah when he is able to speak. His father teaches him, so it's understood how come Torah comes in the first order. But then should be first Ma'asim Tovim, which is the age of 13, when he is obligated to do Ma'asim Tovim, good deeds, reference to mitzvot, and only then he should be blessed that the father should see him reach the age of Chuppah. But one of the answers is, this is precisely the wish that the child will achieve so much in maturity and study and intellectual development that the Chuppah will be like Rabbi Hillel Paritcher, that he will be able to reach the age of Chuppah before the age of Ma'asim Tovim. This is just as a bracket. Now, I brought the concept of Chol Hamoed today because, as I said before, that the opening statement of the Rambam, he explains that the entire restriction to do any form of melacha is not a biblical, it is a rabbinical restriction. Though other authorities are suggesting it is a biblical, but the Rambam nevertheless, seemingly, at least according to some opinions, that he views as the entire restriction to do any melacha on Chol Hamoed is a rabbinical institution that they have introduced for two reasons. Reason number one, since it is being called Mikra Kodesh, translated loosely, a day that is being referred as a holy day. If the Torah calls it holy, so therefore some ways and some style of holiness should be practiced in it. Then he gives a second reason, that since it was a day that the offerings of Chagigah used to be brought in the temple, and the rule is that any day that the offering of an individual is being brought in the temple, it's a day of festivity and prohibition from do any form of melacha. Melacha we have defined already in Ilchot Shabbat. It's a reference to all 39 activities that were done in the construction of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan. However, going back to Chol Hamoed, though that generally, in order to honor the day, you gotta abstain from doing the melachot, but there is 5 exceptions. And the exception number 1 is davar ha'aved, an item that if you're not gonna do it, you will incur a meaningful loss of money. So you're allowed to do it as long as it's not involved with excessive effort. If it involves with excessive effort, you are prohibited to do it. Example, a person sees that the fruits of his field are about to get dry, and if they'll dry, he will lose them, they will be worthless. So it is okay to irrigate his field as long as the supply of the water is available via springs or canals that are running. If it is required to carry water with buckets and moving from one floor to another, it will be restricted. But as long as the process of irrigation is not involved with excessive effort, it's okay. Now, this is when it is certain that he is about to incur a loss. Sometimes it's not certain. For example, outside he has lots of fruit, and he is terrified that soon thieves gonna come and steal it. It's not certain that they will come, and it's not certain that they will steal it even if they will come. Nevertheless, it will be permitted for him to carry those apples or those fruit to the house as long as he does it without publicity. It's called betzin'ah. In a very hush-hush way, it is okay to do it. Then there is a second way that the rabbis permitted a person to do a melacha, with that generally involves with tzorech hamoed. He needs to fix his garment to wear it for the upcoming evening holiday party or festival party that will take tomorrow but still in Chol Hamoed. It's okay for him to fix it as long as he is not doing it ma'asei uman. He doesn't do it in a professional way. He does it in a very amateur way. If he does it professionally, or a professional tailor is doing it, so he needs to do it again betzin'ah, in a hidden way. So the idea, though that a certain condition allowing him to do a melacha, nevertheless a certain layer of restriction must be displayed and demonstrated in order to project that this is indeed accompanied with the spirit of the holiday. A third option when a melacha is given, if it is tzorchei rabim, if it is a communal need. For example, to pay the roads of the street are broken. There is a need for a person to divorce his wife. There is a need to write a debate between people, to judge between people, to fix a tefillin. When it comes to public needs, then so it's seemingly from the Rambam texts that it will be allowed to do it without those restrictions that requires maasei hediot or beshinui. However, according to some of the commentators, I will make a distinction whether those public needs are being done for the holiday or they are being done just for the public. So some of the authorities making a distinction. If it's done for the holiday, then no limits are required. You can do it in any form or shape. But if it's done not for the holiday need, so it needs to be done with a change, with a shinui, or secretly in a hidden way, in order to demonstrate that this is unusual exception. And then there is a fourth scenario when melacha is permitted to do in Chol Hamoed. And the fourth scenario is associated with a poor man that have nothing what to eat. When a person really dependent for the livelihood, for ongoing activity of his trades, of his profession, so not only that he himself is allowed to promote himself and seek for a job in order to earn money, but other people who may or who are not in that state of needs, of desperation as he, but since they are aware that this individual is in a desperate state, so they are allowed to initiate and to approach him. And he says, well, I have for you a job, come and do it for me. That way they will avoid any form of embarrassment, of insult on the part of the poor man. So again, here I'm going to summarize. Here are the 4 exceptions. Some of them are subject to certain conditions, some of them are not. I will summarize. If it is davar ha'aved, an item that is associated with incurring financial loss. If it is tzorchei rabim, the public needs. If it is letzorech hamoed, for the need of the holiday. And if it is a poor man who desperately needs or in a need for the income that he will generate from the completion of whatever job he is trained to do. In the 2nd chapter of today, the Rambam elaborates further and introduces live examples of those principles that he introduced in the 1st chapter, but on top of it, he is also introducing a few more halachot, and I will zoom in on one interesting idea, how same identical activity will vary with the intention of the person have in mind while conducting this activity. And I will explain myself. For example, to go and plow the field, it is a restricted activity if it doesn't fall into the category of 4 exceptions that we have just mentioned. Just to plow a soil, to plow the ground, it is meleches, it is the activity of choresh, which was one of the 39 melochos that were done in the Mishkan. So when an individual is paving or smoothing the ground, he can do it or because he wants the ground to be soft and ready for future planting, or he can do it because he is about to spread on top of the ground straw or food in order to feed whether the crowd or whether to feed his own herd of animals. So if an individual is smoothing the ground, it's very important to make a distinction for what purpose he has in mind by doing so. If his intention is to smooth the ground purposely, it is prohibited. If his intention to smooth the ground in order to prepare a platform to store on the platform food, it is permitted. An individual collects woods from the ground. Again, what was his intention to collecting the woods? If he needs the wood in order to make a fire, to cook or bake, it is permitted. If the reasoning for him to collecting the wood from the ground to leave the ground smooth and ready for future planting, it is prohibited. At the end of the 2nd chapter, the Rambam introduces the following comparison between the eves of holiday and eve of Shabbatot. Same way as it is prohibited for an individual to get involved in any form of excessive activity from afternoon of Shabbat, the same way he is prohibited to do it in the eve of high holidays. Then, on the eve of Passover, given the fact that this is the day where the offerings used to be brought in the temple, and every day that the offering is being brought in the temple is a festive day for the honor of the animal that the offering is being brought. So for that reason, when it comes to eve of Passover, so from midday, it is prohibited to get involved in any form of work. Before the midday, it varies. Some places, they have a custom to do melacha, and some places have a custom not to do melacha. What happens if an individual moves from a place that the custom is to do to the from the more restrictive place to the lighter place, or the opposite? He goes from the lighter place to the more restrictive place. No matter what, he should always take upon himself the severity, whether the severity of the place where he comes from, or whether the severity of the place he is going to. Nevertheless, it is also very important for an individual who comes to a place that they are more light, and they are doing work, and they're not as careful. He should not expose himself that he is extra pious more than them, because it can lead to an unnecessary conflict. So the idea is that no matter how more restrictive personal approach a person should take upon himself, it is as equally important to maintain perfect and balanced social interaction with the surrounding in order to keep peace and avoid any unnecessary conflict. I would like to conclude this part of the Rambam with an interesting note, and the fact that all the rules of Chol Hamoed are being taken from a tractate in the Talmud called the Tractate of Moed Katan. In Moed Katan, the primary subject is the rules of mourning. All the rules of mourning, if God forbid a person loses a relative and he got to mourn, all the customs which are associated with the mourning process are being taken from that Masechet. For that reason, it was not as popular for people to learn these Maseches, because nobody wants to deal with painful and with issues that are invoking sorrow and unpleasantness. It reminds me, years ago, one of the greatest editors of our generations, a rabbi who merited to edit over 50 books in the literature of halakha. He collected literally the final ruling of each and every subject in a very organized manner, in a very readable way. And he was using lots the assistant of both the library of Lubavitch and the personal assistant of the Rebbe as well. And many years ago, I remember he was asking the Rebbe, since he is thinking to collect all the rules about mourning, so he's a little bit hesitant to do so, because mourning is not a happy issue. So what should he do? The Rebbe told him, it's true, mourning is not somebody that everybody is looking for. Nobody is looking to mourn, and nobody definitely looking for reasons to mourn. But the reality is that by you introducing the rules of mournings, the do's and the don't, will be able to save people from terrible mistakes and trouble. So for that reason, the Rebbe encouraged him, and 2 heavy volumes about the rules of mourning was published by him, and many dozens of more books were published as well that are being used so much. So I will conclude those rules of Chol HaMoed, since they are all derived from Maseches Moed Katan, with the following thought. When it comes to mourn, the greatest mourning that we Jews are marking is the mourning of the destruction of the temple. And in the night of Tisha B'Av, which happens to be celebrated or marked first in our parasha, because the roots of Tisha B'Av comes from Parashat Shlach, when the spies came back from Israel with the terrible news, and the entire community cried, and God Almighty promised This time you cried for no reason. Oh, how will I give you reasons at that night throughout history to cry about? So each and every Tisha B'Av, we're reading the book of Eicha. And that in Eicha, there is the following verse that states like this: Gadol kayam shivreinu, oy mi'irpa lanu. Great like the ocean is our broken heart, who will be able to heal it? And all the greatest commentaries are asking, why are you comparing our broken situation to an ocean? What is the rationale, or what is the common denominator between a broken heart and an ocean? So I saw a beautiful explanation. There are many cities, countries, kingdoms fighting with each other. And by a war, like any painful war, you see victims. And you're going through those destructed city after a war, and you see bombed houses, bombed warehouses, living and screaming testimony about the great pain and the great loss that took place over here. Can you imagine if the entire city that have suffered heavily from the bombs and from the destruction being flooded with water? So not only the city got destroyed, on top of it, you adding insult to injury that no one even remember and nobody even will be aware, and the pain is not going to be exposed and displayed. So the pain is being magnified by many more times. So when a person is suffering of a pain and the pain is displayed and other people feel for it, so there is a sense of comfort. But when the entire pain is being concealed, being hidden, being forgotten, or not being treated properly, it's being compared like was flooded, kayam, flooded by the ocean. For that reason, we see something very interesting, which is also connected to our parasha. In our parasha, it says that when they, Yoshua and Caleb, were coming the nation, they used the following sentence, that their shade that was shielding them till now disappeared. And Rashi explains who was their shade was Job. Everybody heard the name Job, is one of the scriptures in the Bible, in the Tanakh. And according to the text of Job, he is the man that remains in the collective memory as a symbol of endless suffering. Always when we want to refer to a person who is in trouble, he says, all his life is tzores v'Eoiv. He has trouble like Eoiv. Eoiv is a symbol of suffering. So some of the darshanim, some of the interpretation why Eoiv is a symbol of suffering, since in the Talmud there is a discussion. Who was Eoiv? In what generation did he live? And then amongst all the opinions, there is an opinion that said the following: Eoiv lo hoyo velo nivro elo moshel hoyo. Eoiv was not a real person who actually lived. He is an allegory. He is a euphemism of an idea that is being transmitted via the story, quote unquote. So can you imagine a person, not only he suffered, not only he went through what he went through, but on top of it later he needs to hear an opinion that states that he was not even there. Can you imagine what type of pain when we are speaking over here? Godol kayom shivreinu, great like the ocean is our broken. Eoiv represents over here this type of destruction that is being covered with the heavy water of the ocean. So interestingly enough, as I said before, that despite the fact that Chol Hamoed represents times of festivity, nevertheless, since it happens to be located in the tractate of Moed Katan, so I guess the same destiny as we were speaking before about our loss is so great like the ocean, that the ocean brings itself wiping out and definitely clearing things that were, or erasing things that were clear and covering them with water. Also, the rules of Chol Hamoed also remains unclear, ruling in the sense, as we said before, that it's not clearly whether it is the Oiraise, whether it is a biblical restriction, or whether it is rabbinical. And even if rabbinical, how far is it rabbinical? And on top of it, there is each and every permitted activity is associated with condition and subject to certain rulings and circumstances. But nevertheless, somewhat of a clarity in the ocean is also an achievement. I will, this so far is basically a summary of the first 2 chapters of the daily Rambam, which concluding the rules of Hilchot Yom Tov. The 3rd chapter of the Rambam today is introducing Passover and both the positive and negative commandments which are associated with Passover. So everybody heard the term Chametz. Chametz is leavened bread, which is prohibited not only to eat, not only to benefit, further than this, not to have even in our possession as well. Now, for an individual who eats Chametz throughout Passover, it is a very severe violation, subject to chorus, and if he has done it unknowingly, so he is subject to a korban, to the offering of chatat. Then, not only chametz is prohibited, but also ta'arovet chametz. Ta'arovet is where chametz is being mixed as part of the ingredients of a food that is not chametz. At the moment that it comes in a form of a mixture, it will also going to be prohibited. Throughout Passover, the amount a person is prohibited is even a tiny. However, his exposure to a liability starts with a kezais, a liability of a punishment. Chametz, not only it will be prohibited throughout Passover, if a chametz she'avar alav pesach, if a person possessed chametz in his property and Pesach passed over, but the chametz is still in his possession, so rabbinically he is restricted from benefiting from this chametz. Reason? He is being penalized. The penalty, since he was supposed to get rid of the chametz and he maintained the chametz in his possession, for that reason he will be punished not by having access to this chametz. More details about the other mitzvot, commandments which associated with Passover. Beside the restriction of chametz, we have other fun stuff like to eat the matzah, to share the story of Passover, and many other mitzvot that we'll cover more in detail the upcoming few days. So at the meantime, thank you very much for your participation, and good night.